3,000 years before the first church was built, God made a deal with a man. To seal that deal, he told the man to cut 5 animals in half and line up the pieces. Then God put the man to sleep and walked between the bloody halves, alone. Both parties were supposed to walk through. Both parties were supposed to swear their lives. But God took both sides of the oath. So who was this man, and why did God choose him out of everyone on earth? If you want to understand why God chose Abraham, you first need to understand what Abraham was walking away from. And what Abraham was walking away from was the most sophisticated civilization on the planet. The city of Ur sat in the Fertile Crescent of southern Mesopotamia, in what is today southeastern Iraq. And when I say city, I don't mean some cluster of mud huts around a well. Ur, in the 3rd millennium BCE, was a metropolis. At its peak, under the 3rd dynasty, roughly 2,000 years before Jesus, Ur had a population of around 65,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities in the entire world at that time. The streets of Ur were laid out in organized grids. The houses had 2 stories, with interior courtyards, drainage systems, and private chapels on the ground floor. Archaeologists have uncovered schools where children learned mathematics and writing in cuneiform script on clay tablets. There were courts of law, trade guilds, and a complex economy built on agriculture, textile production, and long-distance commerce that stretched from the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan to the shores of the Mediterranean. And the plumbing alone would have impressed the Romans 2,000 years later. Homes in Ur had terracotta drainage pipes running beneath the floors. The wealthy had private bathrooms. Some residences had 13 or 14 rooms arranged around a central courtyard where families gathered in the evenings. If you stood in one of those courtyards and looked up, you would see the same stars that God would one day use to illustrate a promise. But the thing that dominated everything, the structure you could see from miles away as you approached the city across the flat Mesopotamian plain, was the Great Ziggurat. Imagine a massive stepped pyramid rising 70 feet into the air, built with millions of mud bricks, its core held together with layers of woven reed matting, and its exterior surfaces coated in baked brick and bitumen. At the very top sat a small temple, and that temple was the home of Nanna, the moon god. Nanna, also known as Sin, was the patron deity of Ur. Everything in the city revolved around him. The calendar was organized around lunar cycles. The festivals, the sacrifices, the economic rhythms of planting and harvesting were all tied to the phases of the moon and the worship of this god. The high priestess of Nanna was often the king's own daughter. The temple complex wasn't just a religious center, it was the administrative and economic heart of the entire city-state. And the worship of Nanna was not casual, it was totalizing. Every commercial transaction in Ur passed through the temple economy. Grain stores, textile workshops, cattle records, all managed by the temple scribes. To be a citizen of Ur was to be a worshipper of Nanna. There was no distinction between civic life and religious life. They were the same thing. This is the world Abraham was born into. This was normal. But here's the thing that gets lost in Sunday school retellings. Ur was not just religiously pagan. It was intellectually sophisticated in ways that make the Abraham story even more astonishing. The scribal schools of Ur produced some of the most advanced mathematical texts in the ancient world. Sumerian scholars at Ur and the surrounding cities had already developed a base 60 number system, which is why we still divide ours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They had sophisticated astronomical observations. They tracked the movements of Venus, predicted lunar eclipses, and mapped constellations with remarkable accuracy. These were not primitive people fumbling in the dark. These were brilliant minds building a civilization of extraordinary complexity, and their brilliance was entirely framed by, dedicated to, and oriented around a religious system that worshipped the moon. So when God called Abraham out of this world, he was not pulling a naive shepherd out of a dusty village. He was pulling a man out of the beating intellectual and spiritual heart of human civilization. It's as if God reached into MIT or Oxford or Silicon Valley and said to someone embedded in the most dominant worldview of the age, "Everything you have been taught is incomplete. Follow me." And this is where the story gets misunderstood. We tend to imagine Abraham as a proto-monotheist, someone who was already inclined toward the one true God, someone who just needed a little push in the right direction. A man sitting in his tent, gazing at the stars, already questioning the idols around him. That is a much later tradition. It comes from rabbinic midrash, written thousands of years after Abraham lived. Beautiful stories about young Abraham smashing his father's idols and debating the logic of polytheism. Those stories are meaningful. They carry theological weight. But the text of Genesis itself tells a very different story. Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. The text is blunt. It says that Terah, Abraham's father, served other gods. The Hebrew verb used is avad, which means to serve or to worship. It is the same verb used for the Israelites serving Pharaoh in Egypt. Terah did not dabble in idol worship. He was devoted to it, and his son grew up in that devotion. Acts chapter 7 confirms this when Stephen, in his speech before the Sanhedrin, describes the God of glory appearing to Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. The implication is clear. Abraham did not seek God. God sought Abraham. The initiative was entirely divine. And this is the first shock of the Abraham story. God did not choose the most righteous man available. He chose a man embedded in a pagan culture, the son of an idol worshipper, a resident of a city whose entire identity was built around the worship of a moon deity. He chose someone who, by every measurable standard, should have been the last person on the list. But that was exactly the point. Because if God had chosen someone who was already righteous, already seeking, already inclined toward monotheism, then the story would be about human merit. It would be about Abraham earning his place through spiritual achievement. And that is precisely the opposite of what the Abraham story is designed to teach. The election of Abraham is a story about grace before the word grace had been invented. And to grasp how radical this was, you need to see what Ur's religion actually looked like up close. Because it wasn't just abstract theology, it was visceral. In 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley began excavating the royal tombs of Ur. What he found there changed our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization forever. The tombs contained staggering wealth. Gold helmets beaten so thin you could see the craftsmanship in every curve. Lapis lazuli jewelry imported from mines in what is now Afghanistan, more than 1,500 miles away. Harps decorated with bull heads made of gold and silver. The artistry rivaled anything produced in Egypt. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't the treasure, it was the bodies. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, Woolley found the remains of dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians and servants, all arranged in orderly rows, all apparently having consumed poison and died voluntarily to accompany their queen into the afterlife. One tomb, known as the Great Death Pit, contained the remains of 74 people, mostly women, dressed in elaborate finery, lying in neat rows as if they had simply laid down and gone to sleep. Woolley found a woman who appeared to have been late to the ceremony. She had a silver hair ribbon coiled in her pocket, not yet put on. She arrived, lay down among the others, and died before she could finish preparing herself. This was ritual mass death, human sacrifice on an organized, institutional scale, and it was connected to the religious system that Abraham grew up in. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind, the silver ribbon in the dead woman's pocket. Because later in this story, when we talk about the binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah, you need to remember this. Abraham came from a world where the sacrifice of human beings to please the gods was not just imaginable. It was normal. It was expected. It was woven into the very fabric of religious life. And the God who called Abraham out of that world was about to rewrite every single rule. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. 3 Hebrew words that split history in half. Lesh lecha. In English, most translations render this as go or go forth. And that translation is fine. It's accurate, but it misses something that anyone who reads Hebrew will tell you jumps off the page. The verb lek already means go. That's all you need to give a command. God could have simply said, lek, go, and the sentence would have been grammatically complete, but he adds lecha, which is a reflexive form. It literally means go to yourself, or go for yourself. This is unusual. Hebrew scholars have debated the significance of this construction for centuries, and the consensus is that it carries a meaning far beyond simple geographic relocation. Lech lecha doesn't just mean leave your country. It means embark on a journey into who you really are. Go toward the person I created you to be. Leave behind the identity that your culture and your family and your city have imposed on you, and discover the identity I have for you. God was not just asking Abraham to change his address. He was asking Abraham to change his entire understanding of reality. And what God asked him to leave was devastating. The text says, "Leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house." In Hebrew, this is structured as a narrowing focus. Land is the broadest category, your entire country, your geographic identity. Birthplace narrows it to your community, your social identity. Father's house narrows it further to your family, your personal identity. God is systematically stripping away every layer of belonging that Abraham has, everything that tells him who he is, everything that gives him status, security, and meaning in the ancient world. And in exchange, God offers him a promise so absurd that it borders on cruel. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. All families of the earth will be blessed through you. Abraham is 75 years old with a barren wife. He has no children, no heir, and no land of his own. And God tells him he's going to become a great nation, that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Try to sit with how that sounded to Abraham, not to you, reading it from the comfort of knowing how the story ends. To him, standing in Haran, probably still mourning his father Terah, who had just died, with his elderly wife Sarah beside him, and some nephew named Lot tagging along. With no GPS, no map, no destination beyond a land that I will show you. The destination itself is unnamed. God doesn't even tell him where he's going. That detail alone would have been terrifying to an ancient Near Eastern mind. In that world, gods were connected to specific places. To leave your land was to leave the protection of your God. To go to an unknown land was to walk into territory controlled by unknown and potentially hostile deities. Abraham was being asked to step off the edge of everything he knew, with nothing but a voice and a promise. And here is where the story takes its first extraordinary turn. Genesis 12, verse 4. So Abram went. 3 words. He didn't ask for details, didn't try to negotiate a better deal, didn't request a sign to confirm what he'd heard. The text simply records that he heard, and he went. Now, later in the story, Abraham will argue with God. He will question God's plans. He will laugh at God's promises. He will try to take matters into his own hands in ways that create generational chaos. Abraham is not presented as a plaster saint. He is presented as a deeply flawed human being who, in this one moment, did something that the Bible treats as the foundation of all faith. He trusted a voice he had never heard before from a God he had not grown up worshipping, and he walked away from everything. The New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 8, says it plainly. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. This is what faith meant before it became a theological category, before it became a word on a bumper sticker or a chapter heading in a systematic theology textbook. Faith, in its original biblical form, looked like a 75-year-old man loading up donkeys in the dark and walking into a desert because a voice told him to. And the land God sent him to was not empty. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, the text tells us that the Canaanites were already in the land. Abraham was not walking into an inheritance. He was walking into someone else's home. He was a stranger, a foreigner, an alien in a land already claimed by other peoples with other gods. He would never own more than a single field in that land during his entire lifetime. A field he had to purchase from the Hittites at full price to bury his wife Sarah. The man to whom God promised an entire country spent his whole life as a tent-dwelling nomad, never settling, never building, never possessing. And yet the text says that at Shechem, at the oak of Moreh, God appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And Abraham built an altar there. That altar is everything. It is Abraham's response to the absurdity of the promise. He cannot see how any of this could possibly come true. He has no children. He owns nothing. He is old. His wife is old. The land is occupied, and he builds an altar. This is the behavior of a man who has decided to act on a promise he cannot verify, from a God he is only beginning to know. And that willingness to walk into the unknown on the basis of a word is what the Bible calls faith. Trust, not perfection, not piety, not religious performance, just trust. But if you think Abraham walked in trust from that point forward, the very next chapter proves you wrong. A famine hits Canaan. The land God just sent Abraham to cannot feed him, and Abraham panics. Genesis 12, verse 10. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and on the way, he turns to his wife Sarah and says something that reveals just how fragile his faith actually is at this point. He tells her that when the Egyptians see how beautiful she is, they will kill him to take her. So he asks her to say she's his sister. Think about what is happening here. The man who just obeyed God's voice and walked away from everything is now lying to protect himself. He is offering his wife to another man's household, letting Pharaoh's court believe she is available, because he is afraid of being killed. And that is exactly what happens. Pharaoh takes Sarah into his household. Abraham, because of the deception, receives enormous wealth: sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants. He gets rich off of lying about his wife, but then God intervenes. He sends plagues on Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh figures out the truth, summons Abraham, and says one of the most cutting lines in the entire Bible. He asks what Abraham has done to him. why he didn't say she was his wife. Then he says, "Take her and go." A pagan king is lecturing the father of faith about honesty. This is Genesis being brutally honest about its hero. Abraham didn't descend from his spiritual mountaintop and walk in perfect faith forever. He stumbled almost immediately. He chose fear over trust, self-preservation over obedience, a human scheme over divine protection, and the Bible puts it right there, just verses after the great calling. And here's what makes this failure remarkable. God doesn't abandon Abraham. God doesn't say, "Well, I chose the wrong guy, let me start over." God rescues Sarah, protects the covenant, and keeps going. The promise survives Abraham's failure, because the covenant was never dependent on Abraham's performance. It was dependent on God's character. That distinction changes everything about how you read the rest of Genesis. Abraham's nephew Lot has been traveling with him since Haran. Both of them have accumulated herds and servants, and the land cannot support them both. Their herdsmen are fighting, and Abraham, in a moment of genuine generosity, tells Lot to choose any part of the land he wants. Lot looks east and sees the plain of the Jordan River. The text says it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Lot chooses the best land, the easy life, the fertile valley. He pitches his tents near Sodom. Abraham stays in the hills of Canaan, the dry land, the difficult land, the promised land. This scene is subtle, but the text is making a point. Lot chose by sight. He looked at the land, saw what was good, and took it. Abraham had been called to walk by faith, not by sight. And the man who walks by faith ends up with the promise. The man who walks by sight ends up near Sodom. But Abraham's quiet life in the hills didn't last long, because something happens next that almost never gets mentioned in sermons: the War of the Kings. Genesis 14 opens with a battle. 4 kings from the east, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam, have been dominating the cities of the plain for 12 years. In the 13th year, those cities rebel. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his allies sweep through the region, crushing every army in their path. They defeat the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and finally, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in the valley of Siddim. The victorious eastern kings loot Sodom and Gomorrah and take captives. Among those captives is Lot. When Abraham hears this, he does something astonishing. He gathers 318 trained men born in his household, and he pursues a coalition of 4 kings who have just defeated multiple armies across the entire region. Stop and think about what this means. Abraham is not just a spiritual figure, he is a military leader. He has over 300 trained warriors in his personal retinue. This is the household of a wealthy desert chieftain, not a wandering mystic. The man who built altars also drilled soldiers. Abraham chases Chedorlaomer's forces all the way to Dan, nearly 150 miles north. He divides his men, attacks at night, and routs the combined armies of 4 kings. He recovers all the people and possessions that have been taken from Sodom, including Lot. This is the same man who lied about his wife in Egypt because he was scared. The same man who couldn't trust God to protect him from Pharaoh is now charging into battle against 4 kings to rescue his nephew. Faith is not a straight line. Faith zigzags. Abraham is brave one day and terrified the next. And the Bible records both because the point was never that Abraham was consistent. The point was that God was consistent. And then, on the way home from this battle, Abraham has one of the strangest encounters in all of Scripture. He meets a man named Melchizedek. Genesis 14, verse 18. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. The name itself is Hebrew. It means King of Righteousness, and he is King of Salem, which is an ancient name for Jerusalem. Salem means peace, so his full title is essentially King of Righteousness, King of Peace. He appears out of nowhere. The text gives us nothing about his family, his origin, or how a priest of God Most High could possibly exist in Canaan before Israel, before the covenant, before any of the structures of biblical religion have been established. He just shows up, blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything. But here's the detail that shows how much Abraham has grown since Egypt. After the battle, the king of Sodom offers Abraham all the recovered loot. Keep everything. You earned it. And Abraham refuses. He says he has lifted his hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that he would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that belongs to Sodom, so that no one could say, I have made Abram rich. The man who got rich off lying about his wife in Egypt now refuses legitimate spoils of war because he wants it to be clear that his wealth comes from God, not from the king of Sodom. Abraham is learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but he is learning. The Egypt disaster taught him something, and the encounter with Melchizedek confirmed something. He is beginning to understand that the God who called him is not just another deity to be managed or appeased. This God is the possessor of heaven and earth. But the hardest lesson was still coming, because now came the waiting. If I could only show you one chapter of the Bible to prove that this book is stranger and deeper than you ever imagined, I would show you Genesis 15. Because Genesis 15 contains one of the most bizarre, most profound, and most theologically explosive scenes in all of ancient literature. And almost nobody talks about it. Here is the setup. Some time has passed since Abraham arrived in Canaan. He has had military victories. He has accumulated wealth. He has met Melchizedek and refused the king of Sodom's offer. By worldly standards, Abraham is doing well. But the one thing God promised him, the thing that would make everything else possible, has not happened. He still has no son. And in Genesis 15, verse 2, Abraham finally says what he's been thinking. He tells God that he remains childless. The heir of his house is Eliezer of Damascus, his servant. This is not a prayer of worship. This is a complaint. Abraham is telling God, respectfully but directly, that the promise is not working. Years have passed. Nothing has changed. The great nation God talked about still consists of 2 old people and a household staff. And God's response is to take Abraham outside at night, under the vast Mesopotamian sky, and tell him to look up and count the stars. Then God says, "So shall your offspring be." Now, modern city dwellers have no idea what this looked like. You and I might step outside and see a few dozen stars through the light pollution. Abraham, standing in the ancient Near East, with zero artificial light for hundreds of miles in every direction, would have seen something that looked like the sky was on fire. Thousands upon thousands of stars, the Milky Way blazing overhead like a river of light. The sheer, overwhelming enormity of the cosmos laid bare. And God says, that is how many descendants you will have. Verse 6 records Abraham's response. He believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Stop here. This single verse may be the most important sentence in the entire Bible. The Apostle Paul builds his entire theology of justification on this verse in Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3. Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation partly on the basis of this verse. The entire Christian understanding of salvation by grace through faith traces back to this moment under the stars. Abraham believed, and that belief, that trust, was credited to him as righteousness, not his obedience, because he had already disobeyed in Egypt, not his sacrifices, because the sacrificial system didn't exist yet, not his moral perfection, because he had already lied about his wife, his trust. But what happens next is where things get truly extraordinary and disturbing and world-changing. Abraham asks God a reasonable follow-up question. In verse 8, he asks how he can know that he will possess the land. He's asking for a guarantee, a contract, some kind of assurance that this promise is binding. And God tells him to bring a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham brings them, cuts the larger animals in half, and arranges the halves opposite each other, creating a pathway of blood between the pieces. Now, if you are a modern reader, this scene makes almost no sense. It feels random, barbaric, and disconnected from anything meaningful. But if you are an ancient Near Eastern reader, you know exactly what is happening, and it would have made your blood run cold. This is a covenant ratification ceremony. In the ancient world, when two parties made a binding agreement, they would cut animals in half, lay the pieces in 2 rows, and then both parties would walk between the pieces together. The symbolism was explicit and understood by everyone. May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break this covenant. Walking between the pieces was a self-curse, a blood oath, the most serious, most binding, most irreversible form of commitment that existed in the ancient world. We have archaeological evidence of this practice from Hittite treaties, from Mari texts, from Assyrian vassal agreements. Jeremiah chapter 34 references this exact custom centuries later, confirming its ongoing significance. A treaty from the ancient city of Alalach, dating to the 18th century BCE, roughly Abraham's time, describes exactly this kind of ceremony between a vassal king and his overlord. Both parties walk through, both parties swear. So when God tells Abraham to prepare the animals, Abraham knows what's coming. They are about to make a covenant. Both of them will walk between the pieces. Both of them will swear with their lives to uphold the terms. Except that is not what happens. Genesis 15, verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. The Hebrew word used for this sleep is tadamah. It's the same word used in Genesis 2 when God put Adam to sleep before creating Eve. This is not ordinary rest. This is a divinely imposed unconsciousness. God knocks Abraham out. And notice the emotional texture of this moment. It's not peaceful sleep. The text says, dreadful and great darkness fell on him. The Hebrew word for dreadful is ema, which means horror or terror. Something terrifying is happening, and Abraham is experiencing it at a primal level, even in his unconscious state. And then, verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. These are symbols of divine presence, the same kind of imagery that will later appear as the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire leading Israel through the wilderness. This is God himself moving between the pieces. And Abraham. Abraham is asleep. Do you understand what just happened? In a covenant ceremony that requires both parties to walk between the pieces and swear their lives, God puts Abraham to sleep and walks through alone. God takes both sides of the oath. God bears the full weight of the covenant. God says, in effect, if this covenant is broken by either party, let the consequences fall on me. This is staggering. In every other ancient Near Eastern covenant, both parties shared the obligation and the risk. Here, God assumes everything: the promises, the obligations, and the consequences of failure. Abraham contributes nothing. Abraham signs nothing. Abraham swears nothing. Abraham is unconscious. The entire weight of the covenant rests on God's own character, God's own faithfulness, God's own willingness to bear the cost of broken promises, even if the one who breaks them is Abraham or his descendants. And God also reveals something else during this ceremony. Between the sleep and the fire, God tells Abraham that his descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They will be servants. They will be afflicted for 400 years. But God will judge the nation that enslaves them, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. This is a preview of Egypt, of the Exodus, of the entire trajectory of Israelite history, compressed into a prophecy spoken to a sleeping man between rows of dead animals. Scholars call this a unilateral covenant, a one-sided agreement, an unconditional promise, and it is the foundation on which everything else in the Bible is built. And if you're paying attention, you've already noticed the foreshadowing. A God who takes the curse of covenant breaking upon himself. A God who says, "If my people fail, let the punishment fall on me." That theological thread doesn't reach its conclusion for another 2,000 years, on a hill outside Jerusalem, on a Roman cross, where the descendant of Abraham bears the covenant curse in his own body. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before we get to the cross, we need to talk about what happened between the covenant and the crucifixion. The years of waiting, the failures of faith, and the moment Abraham took matters into his own hands and created a wound that the Middle East is still bleeding from today. Here is something the Bible does that almost no other religious text in the ancient world does. It shows its heroes failing. After the covenant in Genesis 15, after the stars and the blood and the fire, you would expect the story to accelerate. God made a promise. Abraham believed. Now the promise should come true. Instead, years pass, many years, and nothing happens. Sarah cannot conceive. Month after month, year after year, the promise remains unfulfilled. Therefore, Abraham and Sarah decide to help God out. And this is where the story gets painfully human. In Genesis 16, Sarah suggests that Abraham sleep with her Egyptian servant, Hagar, and have a child through her. Before you judge this, you need to understand that in the ancient Near East, this was a perfectly normal and socially acceptable practice. We have contracts from ancient Mesopotamia, from the very culture Abraham came from, that specifically address the procedure for a barren wife, providing a servant as a surrogate. The Code of Hammurabi mentions it. Marriage contracts from Nuzi, an ancient Hurrian city, contain clauses almost identical to what Sarah proposes. Abraham was not doing something scandalous by the standards of his time. He was doing something perfectly legal and culturally expected. And that is precisely the problem. Because God's promise was never about what was culturally expected. God's promise was about what was humanly impossible. And the moment Abraham resorts to a human solution for a divine promise, things go sideways. Hagar conceives, and immediately the household collapses into jealousy, resentment, and cruelty. Sarah, who suggested the arrangement, turns on Hagar and treats her harshly. The Hebrew word used is ana, the same verb used to describe how the Egyptians will later oppress the Israelites in slavery. Sarah, the future mother of Israel, treats Hagar the way Pharaoh will one day treat Sarah's descendants. The irony is savage. Hagar flees into the desert. Pregnant, alone, enslaved and abused, she runs toward Egypt, toward home, toward the only life she knew before Abraham's household swallowed her whole. And here the text does something extraordinary. God sends an angel to find Hagar, not to find Abraham, not to rebuke Sarah, to find Hagar, the enslaved Egyptian woman running through the wilderness. The angel finds her at a spring on the way to Shur and tells her to go back. But he also gives her something Abraham got, a promise. Her son will be named Ishmael, meaning God hears, and he will be the father of a great people. And Hagar responds with something that no other figure in Genesis does before her. She gives God a name. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees me. A slave woman names God before Moses, before the prophets, before any formal theology of divine names has been established. This is not a footnote. This is the text telling you something about the character of the God who called Abraham. This God does not only see the chosen, he sees the used, he sees the forgotten, he sees the runaway slave pregnant in the desert. Ishmael is born. Abraham is 86 years old, and for 13 years he raises this boy, loves this boy, and almost certainly believes that Ishmael is the promised son. But then God shows up again and changes everything. Genesis 17. Abraham is now 99 years old. God appears and establishes the covenant of circumcision, a physical marker, a sign carved into the body of every male in Abraham's household, a permanent reminder that they belong to a God who has claimed them. The significance of circumcision in its ancient context is worth pausing on. In the ancient Near East, other cultures practiced circumcision, but usually as a puberty rite or a pre-marriage ritual. God takes this existing cultural practice and radically redefines it. He moves it to the 8th day of life, to infancy, before the child can choose or understand or consent. The sign of the covenant is placed on the body before the person has done anything to earn or deserve it. This mirrors the logic of the covenant itself. You didn't earn this. You didn't choose this. This was placed on you by a God who chose you before you could choose him. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many, and Sarai's name to Sarah, meaning princess. And God says, Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And Abraham's response? Genesis 17, verse 17. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. He laughed. The father of faith, the man who believed God and had it counted as righteousness, fell down laughing at the promise of God. And the Hebrew verb used here, Yitzhak, is the very word that becomes his son's name. Isaac means he laughs. This is not presented as sinful. This is presented as human. Abraham is overwhelmed. He is 99 years old, and his wife is 89, and God is telling him they are going to have a baby. Of course he laughed. And then Abraham says something incredibly revealing. He says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." In other words, God, I already have a son. Can't we just work with what we have? And God says no. Sarah will bear a son. His name will be Isaac, and the covenant will be established through him. This moment is gutting if you slow down long enough to feel it. Abraham loves Ishmael. He has loved him for 13 years, and God is telling him that Ishmael, though blessed, is not the child of promise. The plan that Abraham and Sarah devised on their own, the human solution to the divine delay, is not the plan God had in mind. And then comes Abraham's most audacious moment before the binding of Isaac. In Genesis 18, 3 visitors come to Abraham's tent near the oaks of Mamre. Abraham, displaying the extreme hospitality that was the highest virtue of ancient Near Eastern culture, rushes to prepare a meal for them. He asks Sarah to bake bread from the finest flour. He runs to the herd and selects a tender calf. During this visit, the Lord tells Abraham that Sarah will have a son within a year. Sarah, listening from inside the tent, laughs to herself, and God says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Sarah denies laughing. She's afraid, and God says, "You did laugh." There's a tenderness in this exchange that gets lost if you read it too quickly. God is not angry. He is acknowledging the absurdity of what he is promising. A 90-year-old woman having a baby. Of course she laughed. The whole family laughs at this promise, and God names the child after that laughter. But then the conversation shifts, and Abraham does something that no other figure in Genesis does. God reveals that he is about to investigate the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their grievous sin. And Abraham argues with God. He draws near and asks, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city?" And then he bargains. 50, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. Each time God agrees, "If there are 10 righteous people in Sodom, I will not destroy it." This scene is astonishing for several reasons. First, Abraham is interceding for a city that is not his own. Sodom is not his people. He has no obligation to care about them. But he does, because his nephew Lot lives there, and because Abraham has developed something that the pagan world of his time largely lacked: a sense of universal justice, a conviction that the God who judges the earth must do right. Second, Abraham is not afraid to challenge God. He is respectful but relentless. He pushes, and God doesn't punish him for it. The text implies that God welcomes the conversation. This is not a God who demands blind submission. This is a God who invites dialogue. But here's the part that breaks my heart. Abraham stops at 10. He doesn't go lower. He doesn't ask, "What if there are 5? What if there is 1? And in the end, not even 10 righteous people can be found in Sodom, and the city is destroyed. Only Lot and his daughters escape, and even that rescue is messy and traumatic. Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. That image, a person unable to let go of what they're leaving behind, echoes across the Bible and into our own lives. Abraham walked away from Ur without looking back. Lot's wife couldn't do the same with Sodom. The Abraham who negotiated with God is a man who has grown enormously from the man who left Ur. He has gone from silent obedience to active partnership, from passive belief to engaged wrestling. And then, finally, Isaac is born. Genesis 21. Abraham is 100 years old, Sarah is 90, and the impossible happens. The child of promise arrives. The boy whose name means laughter is born to parents who literally laughed at the idea that he could exist. Sarah says, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." For the first time in the Abraham story, there is pure, uncomplicated joy. The waiting is over. The promise is fulfilled. The old man holds his baby son and knows that everything God said was true. But the joy does not last, because another loss is coming. As Isaac grows, the tension between Sarah and Hagar becomes unbearable. Sarah sees Ishmael, now a teenager, playing with Isaac. She tells Abraham to cast out the slave woman with her son, and the text says, "This was very displeasing to Abraham." The Hebrew phrase is, "Vayera hadavar me'od," it was very evil in his eyes. because Ishmael is his son too. He loves Ishmael. He has raised Ishmael for over 13 years, and now Sarah is telling him to send this boy into the desert. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah, but God also promises, again, that Ishmael will become a nation too, because he is Abraham's offspring. So Abraham rises early in the morning, takes bread and a skin of water, gives them to Hagar, puts them on her shoulder along with the child, and sends her away. Read that sentence again, slowly. He rises early, he packs the supplies himself, he puts them on her shoulder, he sends them away. This is not a man who is indifferent. This is a man who is dying inside. Every detail suggests a father who cannot bring himself to do this, and does it anyway, because he has been told to trust God with the outcome. Hagar wanders in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water runs out. She puts Ishmael under a bush because she cannot bear to watch him die. She sits a bowshot away and weeps. And God hears the boy's voice. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven and tells her not to be afraid. God has heard the voice of the boy. Lift him up and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. And God opens her eyes, and she sees a well of water. The God who sees. El Roi. He sees again. He sees the slave woman again. He sees the boy again. He provides water in the desert, the same way he will one day provide water from a rock for the Israelites in Sinai. Ishmael survives. He grows up in the wilderness of Paran. He becomes an archer. His mother finds him a wife from the land of Egypt, and from him comes a line that Islamic tradition traces directly to the Prophet Muhammad. One family's pain, two civilizations, 4,000 years of consequences, and now God has one more thing to ask of Abraham, and this one makes everything else look like a warm-up. Genesis 22 is the most analyzed, most debated, most agonized over chapter in the Hebrew Bible. Philosophers like Kierkegaard have written entire books about it. Jewish scholars have spent millennia interpreting it. Christian theologians see in it the foreshadowing of everything they believe. Islamic tradition honors it as one of the greatest acts of submission in human history. And the reason it haunts us is because, on the surface, it looks like the thing Abraham left behind. Remember Ur. Remember the royal tombs. Remember the silver hair ribbon in the dead woman's pocket. Remember that the world Abraham came from was a world where the gods demanded human sacrifice. And now, in Genesis 22, verse 2, the God who called Abraham out of that world says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Your son, your only son, the one you love." Isaac. The Hebrew piles on the specificity, each phrase narrowing the focus like a knife being sharpened. And notice that God says, "your only son," even though Ishmael is alive. Isaac is not Abraham's only biological son. He is the only son of the covenant. God is specifying the cost with surgical precision. And the first question everyone asks is, how could a good God do this? Hold that question. We will get to it. But first, look at what Abraham does. Genesis 22, verse 3. Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. He rose early. Again, just like when he sent Hagar away, Abraham's darkest moments begin at dawn. He did not delay. He did not argue the way he argued for Sodom. He did not negotiate. He did not laugh the way he laughed at the promise of Isaac. He simply got up, prepared the supplies, and started walking. 3 days of walking. 3 days from Beersheba to the mountains of Moriah. 3 days of traveling with your son beside you, knowing what you believe God has asked you to do. 3 days of silence, of agony, of whatever was happening inside this man's mind. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from a distance. He told his servants to stay with the donkey. He said, "I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Come again to you. Both of us. I and the boy will come back. The author of Hebrews, in chapter 11, interprets this moment directly. He says that Abraham reasoned that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. Abraham had resolved to obey God's command, but he also believed somehow, against all logic, that God would find a way to keep his promise. Because if Isaac dies, the covenant dies, and Abraham had seen enough of this God to know that the covenant would not die. This is faith at its most extreme, not faith as a warm feeling, not faith as intellectual agreement with theological propositions, faith as walking up a mountain with your son and a knife, believing that the God who promised you descendants as numerous as the stars would not let that promise fail, even if you could not see how. Then comes the moment. Isaac speaks, and his words shatter you. "Father," Isaac says, "here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac is not a baby. Most scholars estimate he was somewhere between his early teens and mid-20s at this point. He was old enough to carry the wood up the mountain. He was old enough to understand how sacrifices worked. And he noticed that something essential was missing. Abraham's answer is one of the most loaded sentences in all of Scripture. "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." In Hebrew, this sentence is ambiguous in a way that feels intentional. It can mean, God will provide the lamb for himself, or God will provide himself as the lamb. The grammar allows both readings, and if you are a Christian reading this text, that ambiguity detonates like a bomb. They reach the summit. Abraham builds the altar. He arranges the wood. He binds Isaac and lays him on top. And here is another detail that gets overlooked. Isaac lets himself be bound. This is not a toddler who doesn't understand. This is a young man, likely stronger than his elderly father, who could have resisted, who could have run, who chose not to. Jewish tradition emphasizes this point. The Akedah, the binding, is not just a test of Abraham's obedience. It is a test of Isaac's willingness. Father and son walk together into this moment. Both are choosing. Abraham reaches out his hand and takes the knife, and the angel of the Lord calls from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." The double name. In Scripture, when God says someone's name twice, it signals urgency and intimacy. Abraham, Abraham. He says, "Here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looks up, and caught in a thicket by its horns is a ram. He takes the ram and offers it instead of his son. And Abraham calls the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. The text adds, as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Now here is where the geography becomes theology. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1 identifies Mount Moriah as the location where Solomon would later build the temple in Jerusalem. The mountain where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son is the same mountain where the temple stood, the same mountain where, for centuries, Israel would offer sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins. The same mountain complex where, according to Christian tradition, Jesus of Nazareth, a descendant of Abraham through the line of Isaac, was crucified. Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide," and the text says, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Future tense. Something will happen on this mountain in the future that will fulfill the meaning of this moment. The ram caught in the thicket is a substitute, an animal dying in the place of the son. And this principle of substitution, innocent life offered in place of guilty life, becomes the central mechanism of the entire sacrificial system of Israel. And for Christians, it becomes the interpretive key to the death of Jesus. So why did God ask Abraham to do this? The answer requires understanding what the test was actually about. And it was not about whether Abraham was willing to kill Isaac. It was about whether Abraham had made Isaac into an idol. Remember where Abraham came from. Ur, a city of idols. Abraham left that world behind. But the temptation to idolatry doesn't disappear just because you leave a city. Isaac was the miracle child, the impossible son, the fulfillment of everything Abraham had waited 25 years for. Isaac was the proof that God was real, that the promises were true, that the covenant would continue. And therein lies the danger. Because when the gift becomes more important than the giver, when the blessing becomes more important than the one who blessed, when your identity becomes wrapped up in what God has given you rather than in God Himself, you have built a new idol. God was not asking Abraham to become a child killer. God stopped the sacrifice. God never intended for Isaac to die. The entire point was the willingness, the internal posture, the answer to the question, "Abraham, is there anything in your life that you love more than me?" And Abraham's answer, spoken not in words but in action, was no. Nothing. Not even the son he waited 25 years for. After Moriah, the next major event in Abraham's life is the death of Sarah. Genesis 23. Sarah dies at the age of 127 in Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham comes to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. The Hebrew uses two verbs, lispod to eulogize and livkota to weep for her, the public mourning and the private grief. Abraham does both. And then he does something practical, something that reveals both his faith and his realism. He negotiates with the Hittites to purchase a burial site, the Cave of Machpelah. This negotiation in Genesis 23 is one of the most detailed commercial transactions in the entire Bible. Abraham approaches the sons of Heth. He calls himself a stranger and a sojourner, a resident alien. He asks to buy a burial plot. Ephron names a price of 400 shekels of silver. Abraham weighs out the silver and pays. And this is the only piece of the promised land that Abraham ever legally owns. After decades of wandering, after altars built at Shechem and Bethel and Hebron, after a covenant where God promised him the entire land, Abraham's sole real estate transaction is a cemetery. He buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, and when Abraham himself dies, his sons Isaac and Ishmael will bury him there beside her. Isaac and Ishmael, together, at their father's grave. That detail, buried in Genesis 25, verse 9, is one of the most quietly extraordinary lines in the Bible. The two sons, the child of promise and the child sent away, the one who stayed and the one who was cast out, stand together at the grave of the man who loved them both. Whatever wounds existed between them, whatever the years in the desert had done to Ishmael, he came back for the funeral. He stood beside his brother. They buried their father together. Abraham died at the age of 175, owning exactly one piece of real estate in the Promised Land, a cemetery. The man to whom God said, "All this land will be yours," died with a grave, and yet the text says he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. The Hebrew word for full there is savia, which means satisfied, content, complete. Abraham died satisfied, not because he had received everything he was promised, but because he had walked with the God who promised it. He never saw the nation of Israel. He never saw the temple on Moriah. He never saw David or Solomon or the prophets. He never saw a baby in a manger in Bethlehem. He never saw any of it, but the covenant he carried walked into that future without him, from Abraham to Moses, from Moses to David, from David to the prophets, from the prophets to a teenage girl in Nazareth who said, "Let it be to me according to your word." From that girl to a cross on a hill that the Bible calls the place where God provided, the Mount of the Lord, Moriah, where Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb." And 2,000 years later, on that same mountain complex, a man who called himself the Good Shepherd said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." The lamb that God provided, the covenant that God made in the dark, walking through the blood alone while Abraham slept. The promise that said, "If this fails, let the cost fall on me." It was always heading here. From the first word spoken to an old man in a pagan city, from the first step taken into the unknown, from the first star counted in the dark. 4,000 years ago, an old man loaded up donkeys in the dark, and the world has never been the same. If this story changed how you see the Bible, subscribe. Next week we are going deeper into the story of Jacob, the man who literally wrestled with God and walked away limping. That one is even wilder than this. The video is on screen now.